as we're probably aware, in our world today, one of the places that persecution comes toward Christians is from some of the extremist factions of the Islamic faith. And Jason had as his paper was to study about and learn more about Muhammad and the Quran, which that's the holy book of the Muslim people. So we're going to ask him to come up and tell us a little bit about what he learned of that and give one or two a chance to ask him a question.
Jason.
No questions. All right.
Hey.
Any questions?
Jason.
Probably can have like 3 more of these guys in here do this with me because we all went to mosque together, so I learned quite a bit over there. But it was interesting learning about Muhammad and the Quran. Kind of tried to stay away from the religion so much to just kind of really zoom in on the person of Muhammad and the actual book of the Quran. But definitely, as he said, we know of some things going on in today's world just with the conflicts of religion. But when I first started to approach the subject of Muhammad, kind of thought that I knew quite a bit about it already. So it was interesting getting into some different books that I hadn't read and finding out more about Muhammad. One of the things with the approach to learning about Muhammad and this religion, this great religion that was started based off of the prophecies that he had, was to go back into the history of the Arab world and that region of Arabia before Muhammad came around. And as most of us know, that the Islam or Muslims, the religion Islam is an Abrahamic religion. And so that comes from the belief that they have a lineage with Ishmael, which was the first son of Abraham. And so they believe that Abraham was the promised seed, not Isaac. And so it was God blessed Ishmael, and Ishmael was to be the great nation. And so even from the biblical account, he fathered 12 sons, and they went on to populate that region, the region of Arabia. Eventually they populated the whole Arabian Peninsula. But on Arabia, or on the peninsula, for the most part, it was a nomadic land. The peoples weren't really settled because it's a desert, so resources are very slim. You'll have water in one place for a little bit, and then it dries up and you have to move around. There'll be grass and grazing area for your cattle or for your camels and things, and then you have to move after it's gone. So for the most part, for many years, they were just a nomadic people. There weren't lands that had really settled or anything like that. And it was a very dangerous part of the world. There was no laws, there was no unified way of morality, and so if you strayed, it was pretty much run by tribes. And each tribe had different clans within the tribe that of smaller families. And if you strayed far from your family or from your tribe, you can get killed or you can get attacked. They would steal. There were, robbers out there in the desert, things like that. So it was a lawless land. There was no central government. There was no central religion. They were mostly animistic polytheists, and they had no one god and no one deity, but they believed in many gods and spirits and demons in the desert and things like that. So I say all of this to say that as a great nation, they weren't really that until Muhammad came along. Until he came on the scene, there was no unity. There was no real identity as one people. As far as their connectedness to the rest of the world, they weren't really a people that left their region. They were pretty locked in by the sea, the Red Sea on one side. You had the Indian Ocean to the south, and then you had just a lot of desert. And they really didn't leave that area. So for the most part, they were just a nomadic, feuding kind of people. And Muhammad was born into this climate, and he had a pretty rough life, a pretty rough upbringing. He lost both of his parents at an early age, the age of 6. By the age of 6, both of his parents had died. And then he was passed on to his grandfather, who died after he had been with him for 2 years. So by the age of 8, he had lost both his parents and his grandfather. So he's passed on to his uncle.
There you go.
And his uncle took him in and trained him up to work in commerce. And that was one of the things, that was one of the ways that the Arabs made their living. They controlled a lot of the trade routes going through the Middle East. So from India, Ethiopia, all those lands, China, that would send their silks to Europe, or their spices to the Mediterranean. They had to go through several routes through the Arabian Peninsula, and there were certain tribes that controlled those routes. And Muhammad was a part of one of the most powerful tribes at that time that controlled the route going through Mecca. And at the time, Mecca was a land where, well, it was becoming a pretty big city, because it was the place where the Kaaba was. And the Kaaba is, by Islamic tradition, a shrine or an altar that was built by Abraham. When he was out in the desert with his son Ishmael, they built an altar to the Lord, and apparently there was this meteorite that fell from the sky. It's this black stone that still exists today, that they used as a cornerstone at this altar. And so it became a holy site in Arabia and the regions around there. People would come and worship at the Kaaba. And so the Kaaba became, or the Mecca became a great city of trade and things like that, because people from all around would come to worship at this holy site. And so Muhammad and his family got a lot of money from the people coming in to worship at this place, and they would make pilgrimages to this site. But anyways, so over time, as Muhammad grew up and he would begin traveling with his uncle, trading in Syria and other surrounding lands, he was exposed to monotheism. There was monotheism with the Zoroastrians of Persia. There were Jews in other parts of that land, as well as Christians. And so that was the first time he really got exposed to monotheism. And when he got back to Mecca, he realized that there was this, and during the time really that Muhammad was growing up, Mecca had about 360 different gods that were surrounding, or the Kaaba, that people would come and worship. People would bring their different idols and things to the Kaaba to be worshipped. And so there was one idol there that was the most revered, and it had been inscribed as the most supreme or the highest God. So it was the most worshipped, but it wasn't the only one that was worshipped. This God was named Allah. And so to Muhammad, he believed that this was the one true God. After he had been exposed to monotheism, he thought that seemed the most logical to him. That seemed like that was the right thing. And so he believed that Allah must be that one true God. And so from then on, that was the God that he worshiped as the only God. And eventually, Allah would become synonymous with God in Arabic. So if you say Allah, even the Christians now use Allah to say God. It's the same word now. But that all came from it. At one time, he was just one of the gods of many, and then eventually he became the supreme God. Muhammad, during his travels, he became a highly respected man because he was very honest, and he gained a pretty good reputation with other tribes and with other peoples in other lands, because he was honest with his trading, which was not common in that day and time. And so he gained a pretty serious reputation, and one of his cousins, who was far removed from him, Khadijah, she was a wealthy merchant and widow, she saw him and he caught her attention, and she wanted him to work for her, and she put him in charge of a lot of wealth. And eventually, because of his reputation and the type of man that he was, she proposed marriage to him. And so they got married. She was 40, he was 25 years old. But as marriage was back in those days, it wasn't always just purely love, but oftentimes marriage was a strategic move as well for wealth or for status and things like that. It didn't really help her out to have him for status, but because of the way that he handled his business, it helped her out to gain even more wealth. And then for him, she became kind of a mentor for him in that area. But one day during his travels, he ran into a Syrian Christian monk who is, some scholars believe him to have been an Arian Christian, so a Gnostic Christian, who told him that he was going to be a prophet. And he believed this because apparently there was a shadow that, a cloud that followed Muhammad wherever he went, that shielded him from the sun. And so this Christian monk perceived this to be a foretelling of his prophecy, or that he would become a prophet. And it wasn't long after that that Muhammad had his first vision or first encounter with the angel Gabriel. He went into the mountains of Mecca to pray and meditate, and I think it was around the age of 40 years old where he had his first encounter with Gabriel. And Gabriel told him to recite these words of God, and then he began to give him visions and things like that, and Muhammad began to recite things that the angel Gabriel was giving to him. Initially, he didn't know what happened. He thought he went crazy. He went back to Khadijah, telling her, hey, I don't know what's going on with me. Am I going crazy? And she was trying to console him. And then her brother, her cousin, who some scholars believe to have been an Ebionite Christian, which they were some of the first Christians that came about in Jerusalem. Many of them were Jewish Christians. Some were Judaizers. But he also supported him in his vision, saying, if God came to you through Gabriel, like, this is legit, just keep going with it. So he felt confident that God had come to him, but then there was a long time before God came to him again through Gabriel, and so he became very depressed. But eventually Gabriel did come back to him and gave him more visions, and he began to speak these visions. I'm going a little long. But
I tell the church that every week.
there you go. All right, so he understands. So after he began telling these visions to the people in the towns, most people didn't listen to him. Most people didn't believe, because he was saying things against polytheism. He was saying things against the fighting and the feuding, and they didn't like that because that wasn't the way of Mecca. That was how his tribe made money, and so they didn't like the fact that he was coming back here telling them to get rid of their gods and everything else and worship just one God. How would they continue to remain powerful? So they tried to shut him down, and he only had a few followers for many years. And then after several years, his uncle died, and he was the leader of his tribe. Once his uncle died, it pretty much opened up the floodgates for his tribe to persecute him and get him out of the way, because they didn't like the things that he was teaching. And so Muhammad fled to a nearby town of Medina, where he gained a pretty good following. And after he gained a following in Medina, and they believed his words, he unified the Arabs and Jews that were there that were feuding. And after he gained a pretty serious following, he decided that he wanted to go back to Mecca to try to bring monotheism and the belief in Allah back to Mecca. And so
eventually attacked one of the caravans that were coming past the city that were from Mecca, and he overtook them, and then that started a series of battles between the Meccans and the Medinans, of which most of them Muhammad won. In fact, I think all of them except one did they win. And so this was seen as a prophecy that he must be telling the truth, because each time the Meccans overpowered, or they outnumbered the Medinans by great numbers. And so the fact that the Medinans won, which now were calling themselves Muslims, which just means to be submissive or to submit to God, that's what a Muslim means. They believe that this must have been, or this must be the true God, since they were able to overcome such great numbers. And so around the year 630, Muhammad took 10,000 soldiers back to Mecca, and he took over that city of polytheists and the people of his tribe. He took over that city with very few deaths. Most of them submitted because of the power that he had and the number of people that he brought with him. And they destroyed all of the idols, and they destroyed all of the different books and things that had been written to these about these idols, and the belief in Allah and the worship of Allah became the one religion there. And then over the next 2 years, Muhammad went on to conquer the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, which was a very great feat. Nobody had really done anything like this up to that time as far as conquering such a vast land in such a short amount of time. And so in the year 632, pretty much the whole Arabian Peninsula had been conquered by Muhammad, and Muhammad was able to make his first pilgrimage to Mecca from Medina, and now they do that every year. The Muslims do make this pilgrimage to Mecca where the Kaaba is. But they're now, instead of them worshiping all of the idol gods, they make this pilgrimage to the one God, Allah. So for Muhammad and the Arab people look to Muhammad as being a unifier of that region and a unifier of their people. Before, they had not been unified. They did not have one moral way to live. They did not have one God. They did not have a government and a structure with their politics. And Muhammad did all of that in his teachings. The teachings of Muhammad gave them morality. It gave them a one God. It gave them family and unity amongst their people. And so he is the one that is seen to have made them a great nation, as they believe was prophesied in the Old Testament, that they would be a great nation. So they believe that is why, and that's one of the reasons that makes Muhammad a true prophet, because he brought about this prophecy that they would be a great nation. After his death, I'm almost finished. After his death, there was a feud between the different groups about who would be the next, or who would be the successor of Muhammad. And it was between, most people believed that he should be succeeded by just another great leader, like whoever a great follower was of his, one of his disciples. And then a smaller group believed that he should be succeeded by one of his family members. But they didn't go with the family members. They took a vote, and one of his disciples was chosen, Abu Bakr. And he was the first one, first caliph, or first leader, as they call it, that would compile the Quran. So after Muhammad died, all of his disciples compiled his writings, or compiled his sayings, and gathered up all of his teachings. Some of them just recited them and they wrote them down. And so Abu Bakr took all of these writings and compiled them into one book. And then by the third caliph, he came along and he revised the Quran, because the Quran had, from the different stories and accounts, there were, from the different disciples, there were some stories that varied just a little bit, And also there were different dialects in the writings. And so the third caliph decided that he wanted to make this a unified body of work. And so he took everything that was, all the stories he kept, but stories that had some difference, he discarded those. And then the stories that were in a different dialect from what Muhammad spoke, he discarded those as well. And so he's the one that made the revised and complete version of the Quran, which is the Quran that became the version that would go on to be copied, and it's the same version that they have today. The Quran they believe to be directly given by revelation from God, so they believe it to be a holy book. They believe it to be infallible and incorruptible. And so as it stands today, they will not, that the Quran should not be translated, but they realize that it comes in handy to translate it for the different peoples that believe but don't know Arabic. But overall, if you talk to an imam today or talk to a Muslim, especially from the Middle East, they don't believe in translations. That's not the infallible version. They'll suffer you to have an English version or something in another language, but they believe that to be part of the perfection of that word, and that the Quran was written in the best Arabic. It was the best Arabic that had ever been written, and that's one of the things that they say was a miracle in and of itself. That Muhammad wrote this book, or that he had these sayings, and now they've been written down, but it is the best Arabic ever written, and you can't top this level of writing. And so it's one of their challenges to anybody. If you want to test and see how perfect this book is, try to write something with better language than this book. So it's a miracle in and of itself, is how they look at it. But anyways, there's different ways of them of their interpretation. Some groups translate it or interpret it literally, and others believe there's an inner and outer meaning. So it just depends, but that's why you have some extremists that take every word literally, and if it says fight, if it says kill, they believe that that's literal, like do that today. Some believe that it only applied for that day and time, and then others believe that it's meant to be taken allegorically, or just as a lesson to us. So it just all depends on who's interpreting it. But overall, yeah, taken literally, blah, blah, blah. Okay. But overall, this is their central book to Islam. They have other books, the Hadith, which is just the traditions that they use to help interpret the Quran. Some believe that if you read the Quran in its actual order, the Quran is made up of 114 chapters they call surahs, and the surahs are divided between the ones that were written in Mecca and the ones that were written in Medina, but it's not compiled in that order. So it's not compiled in the order of which the order that he wrote them in. It's their own combination or compilation order that they wanted to choose. But they say if you read it in the order that it was written, you'll get a different message from how most people interpret it today. So that's some of the people that would criticize Islam and would criticize how they believe and interpret it, would say, read it in the order that he wrote it, and you'll get the message that he really intended. But the Muslims would push back on that to say that based on Muhammad's last sermon, they know what he meant by his Quran. And one of the things from his last sermon that he taught was a unification of peoples, to love your neighbors, that there is no difference between black or white, rich or poor, to take care of the sick, take care of the women and children, and things like that. So they believe that he ultimately would preach God's message, that he was a unifier, and that he taught love and peace. And they decide that by the last word that he gave to all the people. So ultimately, Muhammad is seen as a unifier. He's seen as a great man of wisdom, and his book is seen as the prophecy written from God that was sent from heaven and sent down to earth. He was a statement in Medina, but a rebel in Mecca, and he eventually came to be loved by both and by all.
Come on.
Jason, what does the word Quran or Quran mean? Did you run?
Quran means to be recited, or that which is meant to recite.
Okay. Yeah, they put a great deal of emphasis on memorizing it and or just reading it as it is, instead of reading about it, just reading it. So you'll often see large groups of men, particularly sitting together, each with their own copy, and they're reciting it.
Yeah.
And they often read it out loud as they're reading. Well, I appreciate that. You'll probably all the rest of your life now remember know more about this than most of us do. I'll catch you next time, Michelle. Is that okay?
Oh, that'd be lovely.
Okay. We're not going to have Michelle get up and speak to us next time, but I will sort of interview her from her seat and ask her a few questions about her paper. She wrote on William Tyndale, one of the fathers of the English Bible, and a great story there. But what I want to do at this time is take about 25 minutes and watch a video here, and then we'll use the rest of our time until the bell rings to talk a little bit about persecution in our current generations and look at those things. Now let me tell you what this is that we're going to watch. It's a whole series of videos. They're called That the World May Know is how it all began being called, Faith Lessons. It's done by a man by the name of Ray Vanderlaan. And he's a part of the Dutch Reformed Church up in South Bend, Indiana, and that region up there. And we already know something about the Reformers and what they're, the modern Dutch, many of them are not as Calvinistic as the earlier ones were, but there's still some real hardliners among them. But he's taken a real interest in trying to understand the background to the story of the Bible, how Judaism influenced Christianity and so forth. So every year, for many years, he's led groups of people on tours over to the so-called Holy Land, Israel, Jordan, but beyond that up to the 7 churches of Asia, Asia Minor, all the areas covered in different parts of the Bible, and then Focus on the Family and Zondervan have worked together to package those into sets of DVDs. They're just getting ready to release their 15th DVD. I own the first 14. I've shown every one of them to our congregation down in Odessa during the summertime. We'll take Sunday nights and watch a series of 5 or 6 lessons by Mr. Vanderlaan. I've also had the chance to go hear him speak in person. He spoke a couple of years ago at a congregation over in Midland, Texas, so I went over and got to hear him speak. Very interesting person. Maybe even a little weird in some ways. That's my judgment on that matter. But the one we're going to watch today is he's taken a group to Asia Minor, and they're visiting some of the places that are important, as mentioned in the travels of Paul, the missionary journeys of Paul, and then we know in later early church history that were very important to Christianity. And one of those places is Cappadocia. In fact, you might remember back by the time we were talking about the Council of Nicaea and the Trinitarian controversy, and the church was trying to settle on what the Bible really taught about the nature of Christ and his relationship both to man and to God. 3 individuals that really rose up between the Council of Nicaea and the next council they had were men that were called the 3 Cappadocians, or the Great Cappadocians. They were all from this area of the interior of Asia Minor to Turkey today, and had a great influence on what eventually became the Nicene Creed, because they all seemed to be very scholarly and had a clear idea of this. Well, that's where they're visiting, is this area of Cappadocia, but he's focusing on the part when before these men came along, when this was an area where often Christians were persecuted. And so we're going to watch this one video called Why Christians Suffer. One of the young ladies that's in that group, you possibly saw her, she's a little darker skin color than all the others because she's a Sudanese Christian. And in the next video, which I haven't shown you, they asked her to tell what it was like when she was fleeing with her family in southern Sudan, where Christians today are dying, when she was just a girl. Her father was killed. Her mother died beside her. Her aunt, I believe it was, then is taking her by the hand as a little girl, and they're running for their life. And they see people being shot down, literally, on either side of them. And the only reason is that they were Christians, and the Muslim extremists in that region were trying to take it over. And they were killing everyone they could. Of course, she survived that and managed to get to the United States and so forth, but it's also a pretty moving thing, as you would expect, not just what the ancient Christians went through, but even what Christians today are still enduring. Okay, let's take our last 15 minutes here or so and talk about some martyrdom in the 20th century. We've mentioned this, I think, earlier. The Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim empire that came out of really the results of the Crusades in the 1100s and 1200s, took control of much of the region of the Holy Land, Turkey, Syria, Israel, Jordan, and continued to control a lot of that region, even the some part of what is today is southern USS, was the USSR, now is independent nations, but including Armenia, which is sort of the north and east of Turkey. But they, ma'am?
Were these Islamic?
Yes, they're Muslim. And I don't know what all the reasons were for inspiring this, but starting about in 1894, the Ottoman Turk government decided to eradicate the Armenian Christian community. Most of Armenia, not all of it, but a significant amount of Armenia at that time was Christian, Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox. And they began a policy, in some ways it sounds very much like later Hitler did in Germany and Poland. And they would gather these people up in large groups. The women and children many times would be marched out into the desert and surrounded by Turkish soldiers, would be guarded there until they literally died of starvation or thirst. The men would be gathered up and shot before firing squads. That began in 1894, and it took place off and on. This is a picture of them marching some of the people out into the desert. It became worse when World War I broke out because the eyes of the rest of the world was not on them anymore. And so from 1914 to 1922, this accelerated and continued. It's estimated that the best numbers, and these are some of the more conservative ones I've seen, is that 3.5 million Christians were killed that were a part of the Ottoman Turk Empire, mostly Armenian, and were assassinated or murdered during this period of time from 1894 through 1922. You don't usually hear about that. If it makes it into our world history books, it won't be more than a sentence or two. But there's lots and lots of evidence and a few survivors who told the stories the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1922, partly once the World War I was over, then the Allies could turn their attention back to what's going on here because they were a part of the Axis powers. And it was brought to an end in 1922, but 3.5 million estimated minimum Christians died. Yes, sir.
There's a movie called The Promise.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. I forgot to. There's a movie that's just been out at the theater, sort of like Silence. You're not hearing all that much about it, but it's called The Promise. It is, again, a fictional story, but set in this historical context. It is taking place in Turkey while this genocide, genocide of Armenians, genocide of Christians is going on. And the story is set within that context and people trying to get out of that. Then here's another one we don't hear too much about. We know about the Soviet, ancient Russia, then Lenin and communism, 1917, the Russian Revolution, the setting up of this new kind of government based on socialism, communism. Very quickly, the person who rises to the top to replace Lenin, who dies, is a man by the name of Stalin, who then from like 1922 until his death in the 1950s is the total dictator of this country that's actually made up of a lot of countries originally. That's why it's called the United Soviet Socialist Republics. 16 nations, I believe it was, 15 or 16, welded together into one. Well, this whole region had ever since starting around the 700s AD, had been Orthodox Christian. But when communism took over, communism took a stance that religion was the opiate of the people. It was a lie, it was a sickness, it was a disease. It needed to be eradicated, and those who would not surrender it needed to die along with it. And while we know a lot of things about Stalin and how he took his political enemies and sent them off to gulags, basically concentration camps where they were never heard from again, or the mines, just like the ancient Romans did, worked them to death in the mines. What is not often said is how many of those people, there were political enemies only in the sense that they were confessing Orthodox Christians who would not give up their faith. Priests, bishops, everyday members of the church. And again, you see widely varying numbers because not all the records, but most of the records that might have been being kept by his administration have been destroyed, many of them by him or his successor Khrushchev. The estimated number that died who were Christian, not the total number, but the estimated number of those who died under his reign all those years is 22 million. 22 million people in the 20th century in one country die because they're Christians, and we hear nothing about it. When Hitler took over in Germany, of course that began in the 1920s, and when he first started up, he said that the Nazi Party, we're Christians, and anyone who says anything against Christianity will have to answer to us. That's my paraphrase. Soon, Christianity was his enemy. And the churches in Germany, as he continues outreach in the 30s to the other nations around, those who did not submit to Nazism and changed their churches to fit the Nazi propaganda and philosophy, became the enemies. And so in those concentration camps that we hear so much about, Auschwitz and some 6.5 million Jews who died there. What they're not often telling you that actually 15 million people total died in those camps. Who were the rest of those people? They were not all Christians, but some 5.7 million were. Many of them Polish, because Poland was a devoutly Catholic nation. One of the most recent popes was from Poland. Survived this. But they were gathered up. I admit, and again, refer to the lady that's written a book about the myth of martyrdom. She'll say, oh, they weren't killed because they were Christian. They were killed because they were Polish. They were killed because they were Polish Catholics. There were plenty of Polish people that were not killed or even persecuted because they quickly bowed to Nazism and made their pledge to it. And they didn't suffer, but the Polish Catholics would not bow. Now, some of the churches in Germany during Hitler's reign cooperated with them, and that's a sad part of the story. They did that to avoid persecution, but others did not. One of the most famous one was already a pretty prominent theologian. Well, I just knocked me off, didn't I? It was a prominent theologian by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Sometime hear about him. He was a leader in the opposing church, the free church that opposed Nazism, would not let Nazi officials come in and tell them what to do and so forth. So they were driven underground. And he was finally arrested and sent to the concentration camps because he was implicated in a plot to try to assassinate Hitler, one of many plots against Hitler. And whenever the Allies were moving into Germany, when they were 1 week away from the camp he was in, the word came down from Berlin, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer was marched outside of the camp and hanged, just to guarantee that he would not live to see liberation. But he was only one of some 5.7 million believers who died under Hitler. Not even counting the ones who died in the wars. These are the ones who were basically exterminated just like the Jews were. This was a Christian Holocaust that was taking place. And again, that you seldom hear about. Interestingly enough, if you go to some of the major Jewish websites that talk about the Holocaust and have all the records, they give a lot of attention to the Christians who also died alongside them in those camps. They give them more credit than our own history books do. Very interesting. Uganda. This is older than some of you, at least remembering, but there was a man for about 8 or 9 years in Uganda and Africa by the name of Idi Amin, who wanted to turn it into a sort of a combination communist and Muslim state, even though only a small fraction of the population of Uganda was Muslim. It was majority Christian, about 60% Christian. And it's estimated over the 8 years that he had his reign of terror in that country that between 300 and 400,000 Christians died simply because they were Christians and not for any other reason. There's all sorts of other ones we can mention. I didn't try to gather pictures together for them. Right now in Egypt, Coptic Christians in Egypt are still suffering. You hear it on the news from time to time, explosions in Coptic churches. Several hundred a year at least are dying and have been for the last 20 or 30 years in Egypt, who are all part of the Coptic community. And it's mostly coming from the Muslim extremists that are in Egypt. In Nigeria, the same thing happens. We hear about this group called, Boko Haram, that here a couple of years ago captured the 250 or 60 schoolgirls and carried them away, and a good number of those still have not been recovered. But they carry out regular raids into communities and towns and villages, especially in northern Nigeria. And over the last 10 years, an average of more than 2,000 Christians a year have been dying in Nigeria at the hands of the Boko Haram. Some of them burned alive inside their church buildings. Others just taken out and shot because they're not Muslim and they're Christian. And that's still going on today. In Indonesia, over 10,000 Christians have been killed since 2000 by Muslim extremists. Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim country in terms of population. More than 90% of the population is Muslim. That other 10% is not all Christian. Christians are suffering there. Their church buildings are being burned down. We have a school there. We have, not just using Christian in the broader sense, their churches of Christ are there and very active there. Graduates of this school are teachers there. Their students, who are now gospel preachers carrying the gospel throughout Indonesia, are the ones suffering. And their churches are the ones often targeted by them in Indonesia. In Pakistan, the same thing is happening. Pakistani Christians are not given rights by the government. They're not protected by the government. They're not guaranteed religious freedom. And often, again, their church buildings and they themselves are subject to injury or death. And so hundreds die there. In Sudan, we've got a brother. He's not in Sudan right now because they've been driven back out again. He's one of our graduates, Isaiah Jackson, is Sudanese. He and 4 other Sudanese men fled in part of the earlier upheaval in Sudan, came under special arrangement by the United States to Houston. The church congregation in Houston reached out to the Sudanese community that was growing there in Houston of these refugees. These 5 men became Christians. They came to Sunset and all went through the program here. I remember Isaiah, and I remember Costa in particular. Costa was the tallest of all of them. And but after they graduated, they each went their separate ways to do what they can to spread the kingdom. But Isaiah goes back, and he works in the refugee camps that surround the nation of Sudan today, refugees out of Sudan. And when for a short while here, a couple of years ago, Sudan opened up for a year or so, he went in at the risk of his life, establishing churches, baptizing people, preaching the gospel. But now the Sudan broke into 2 nations here, 2 or 3 years ago, with South Sudan, North Sudan. South Sudan, the president of South Sudan and now the vice president are at war with each other. And so it's back in civil war again, and they've been driven back out.
Richard, you know we haven't worked, Sunset hasn't worked in Cairo.
Yes.
There is a church building there, and we have 2 missionaries.
Yes. Yep, and that's a part of the Coptic.
It's a little scary.
Yep. Then there's Libya. We might think of Libya from a number of years ago, Muammar Gaddafi, and bringing down a couple of international airplane flights and so forth. But after his death, that nation, you'd think that after his death that nation would go more moderate, but it went more radical. And when he died in 2011, it was estimated there were 100,000 Coptic Christians in Libya. There are no Christians that we know of in Libya today, just 6 years later. Remember the pictures a year or so ago showing these guys in orange jumpsuits on their knees on a beach with guys with masks on behind them with automatic weapons behind them? Those were Libyan Christians. And they were being assassinated. They were being killed. Yeah. And so, as it says in Hebrews, we read the 13:3 last time, but catch the first one here, Hebrews 10. Hebrews 10:32. Remember those earlier days after you had received the light, when you stood your ground in a great contest in the face of suffering? Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You sympathized with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. And then 13:3 again, remember those in prison as if you were their fellow prisoners, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. I hope the next time you hear about Coptic Christians or Armenian Christians or Chinese Christians or whatever it might be, Indonesian Christians suffering, that the time we've spent the last two sessions together will make you, as it does me, a little more sensitive to the fact that while we may differ with them on a lot of things, these are still people, whether we understand fully whether they're New Testament Christians or not, these are people who have trusted their salvation to the Lord Jesus Christ. And they want to be right with Him, and they're dying for it. And someday we may be too. All right, thank you very much.